Уважаемые коллеги, дорогие друзья, добрый вечер. Спасибо, кто пришли. Очень приятно.
Dear friends, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to see you.
The opportunity to speak with you today. 1 year ago, I had the privilege to be here with you at PHDays and to present for the first time the results on a research on extortion and cooperation in the zero-day market through the lens of game theory. This research received enormous interest from all the parties involved. And throughout the year, I had the opportunity to present those results to other esteemed audience around the world and to listen to their remarks and comments. Most notably, a colleague in Japan asked me what I thought about the ethical questions related to the trade of vulnerability information and zero-day exploits, and if those questions were meaningless to me. While they are far from being meaningless to me, at the time I sidestepped providing a fully satisfactory answer to this friend because I was not into this business. And I was mostly concerned with the economics of vulnerability markets. So I tried to suggest, and it was true, that in this space around the world there are different sensibilities when it comes to trading vulnerability information and the ethical dilemma related to it. And that if we would have worked towards aligning the incentives into the space, we would have led in turn to better and more ethical business practices. Later, after careful consideration, I decided to go from theory to practice, and I entered the space. But in so doing, the ethical questions related to the trade of vulnerability information could not be postponed any further. So what I want to do today with your help is to briefly review the vulnerability supply chain, its main actors, and the surrounding ethical questions. So after setting the context, after setting the stage, I will share with you what I'm doing in order to address those questions in my day-to-day business operation. And I will tell you about the code of business ethics that I established and the principles and ethical standards I hold to in the conduct of my business. In doing so, it's not my intention to neither lecture anybody about how they're expected to behave, nor to provide definitive answer to pressing challenges. I will be happy if I will have asked more questions than given answers, and if I will have provide some principles and standards to build upon for the future. So let's get started. How many of you are familiar with the Philip K. Dick 1968 novel, Do Androids Dream, Electric Ships? Anyone? Great. And how many of you are familiar with the 1982 film by Ridley Scott, Blade Runner? Cool. I know that you watched it. So the story I want to tell you today is a story that finds inspiration in a science fiction novel. And as we are about to overtake the moment in time in which the story is set, tells about the present we're living, some of the ethical questions arises, and what I'm going to do to approach them. Shortly, I will introduce you to the dramatis personae of our story. Their story is the story of the vulnerability supply chain, composed, among others, of software makers creating vulnerabilities as part of the product development lifecycle, unwillingly, but they're creating vulnerabilities. Vulnerability researchers going after and finding existing vulnerabilities and writing exploit for them in order to take advantage of those vulnerabilities. And as a case in point, I have a contribution here. What you can see, maybe you already recognize this is a Russian house, and this guy is a fellow Russian hacker, exploiting a playpen a day in order to win a sandbox escape. Literally, I mean, a literal sandbox escape. Isn't it cool? Dawaj, молодец. And of course, along vulnerability researchers, we have brokers trading vulnerability information and zero-day exploits, and some organizations willing to use the resulting capabilities for good or ill. Their story is also our story. So let's try to draw a parallel between the fictional Anno Domini 2019 and the present we are living in. The Anno Domini 2019 depicted in Blade Runner is a time of societal decline, where technology has polluted the earth and seized control of the cities. Enormous power is entrusted in the hands of corporations, and Los Angeles has started one of those Jeremy Bentham panopticons whereby it's possible that one is being watched, but you never know if you are being watched. So extreme caution needs to be exercised at all time. The roving spotlight present throughout this film tells about the presence of ubiquitous surveillance. And androids, the replicants, need to be stay in character also when alone. As noted by the Harvard psychologist in 1988, Shoshana Zuboff, this is what we call anticipatory conformity. Interestingly, though, surveillance is not only the point of contact between fiction and reality. Let's consider pollution. Let's consider pollution because vulnerabilities are like pollutants. The private upfront cost of insecure software is near zero to most, like the cost of waste dumping, for instance. But the social cost of it, the social cost of insecure software is very high. It's almost unbearable. That is to say that, as for today, software security is an externality, because the market does not provide significant or compelling incentives to build secure software. As a result, software makers are practicing unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants. This comes as no surprise, because building security into our products is in stark contrast with the sheep, then test paradigm, the don't worry, be crappy mantra advocated by entrepreneurs innovating the most. Therefore, in absence of a policy discouraging the unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants, defenders are too busy mopping the floor to turn off the faucet. That is to say that the market participants, in doing patching, filtering, and protecting the system, are doing little or nothing in order to stop the dump of pollution that occurs upstream. Hence, poorly written, insecure software is not any longer a technological issue. Poorly written, insecure software is a public policy issue. Because software vulnerabilities are leaving consumers, businesses, national infrastructures, government, and military vulnerable to attacks. Even worse, there is no such thing as secure software. Every software of non-trivial complexity contains bugs. So we need to keep doing patching, but patch here works like a perverse incentive. Patching works like a perverse incentive because it allows software manufacturers to optimize market and legal protection by renegotiating contract terms buyers could not negotiate in the first place, right? This is how every time a vulnerability comes out, we are faced with signing a new license agreement. But in doing so, software manufacturers have the opportunity to renegotiate contract terms the user, the buyer, could not negotiate in the first place. So we have a choice. we have a take it or leave it choice. Either I accept the software licensing agreement and keep patching the software I rely on in my day-to-day business, or I don't, and I risk exploitation. This is a deal I can refuse, and neither can you. All of which is to say that corporate power is as much a key feature in the fictional Blade Runner society as a signature of our industry. And as a final note of color, the Shimata Dominguez Corporation slogan in Blade Runner is helping America into the new world. And I find it interesting that Donald Trump chose Make America Great Again as his slogan. Don't you think it's remarkably similar? Meet Deckard, Rick Deckard. Deckard is a selfish, self-involved specialist plainclothes ex-police officer or an officially sanctioned bounty hunter that goes after renegade androids, also known as Andes. Here surely is where the parallel breaks down, because officially or tacitly sanctioned bounty hunters in the security industry are certainly not faced with retiring 6 escape Nexus 6 androids, but we are after software pollutants, software vulnerabilities that are done by software makers upstream. And we need to write code, exploits, to constructively prove the risks associated with those vulnerabilities. Of course, there are organizations, both in government and industry sectors, that are willing to acquire those capabilities in order to enable their security strategies. And there are various market types that compete with each other in order to win the preference of bounty hunters towards their vulnerability disclosure policy of choice. So wherever we turn our attention in the vulnerability supply chain, from software vendors, vulnerability researchers, government agencies, all industry actors face their respective ethical dilemmas and questions related to the existence of vulnerabilities into our software and the knowledge of their existence. So therefore, I want to ask you, who holds the moral low ground? The ruthless malefactors exploiting yet another remote code execution vulnerability, or vendors practicing unrestrained vulnerability dumping onto the downstream market participants? Who are the ones that exploit us the most? Foreign security services taking total control of our mobile assets, or vendors using patching to optimize their market-legal protections and to renegotiate contract terms users could not negotiate in the first place. And if our governments introduce trade controls to administer the export intrusion software, should we demand software manufacturers to internalize the cost of insecure software that we import into our life for reason of symmetry? And should we make them liable for the defects and flaws that allowed intrusion in the first place? With incomplete knowledge about the real-world security system we entrust our business, is it even ethical to refrain us from hunting vulnerabilities or to prevent others from doing likewise, as already happened too many times in the past? And what should do a security researcher when the vulnerability gets found? Is full disclosure an acceptable course of action? Does full disclosure becomes more acceptable if the affected vendor ignores the vulnerabilities that were reported responsibly or fails to provide a timely patch? And does coordinated vulnerability disclosure provide a more ethical sound path to be taken? And does the same path remains morally preferable if one of the parties who received the vulnerability information from the coordinator disclose to use that vulnerability information to exploit vulnerable entities, as it already happened with the Carnegie Mellon University disclosing a Tor vulnerability to the US CERT Coordination Center? And are bug bounty programs exploiting bounty hunters if they pay for the same vulnerability information only a fraction of the real market price for that vulnerability information? Should bug hunters pretend to get paid if other party has not asked them to do their work, and what government security agencies should do with the vulnerabilities. Should they exploit them, or should they let everybody else mitigate them, the way they already do? Should they take advantage for those vulnerabilities to benefit a limited number of stakeholders, or should they disclose them to all affected constituents? And with the power, has the power inequity in the vulnerability equation to be balanced, with entities affected by vulnerabilities spread all around the world, how to inform the public, with vendors threatening legal action and support by their significant financial resources, how to protect the security researcher. And can we regard hacking to be an ethical practice and condemn at the same time the trade of capabilities enabling that practice as immoral? Can we regard hacking to be an ethical practice and condemn at the same time the trade of the capabilities enabling that practice as immoral? As an ethically concerned trader of vulnerability information and security capabilities, I established a code of business ethics and I hold to its principles and standards in the conduct of my business. I set forth 6 principles and 8 corresponding standards. And the principles are aspirational goals. They are aimed at guiding and inspiring the conduct of business and are underpinning the ethical standards. The ethical standards are enforceable rules for the day-to-day business operation. So let's give them a look. Principle A is the clean hands principle. It asks me to respect all human rights proclaimed by international human rights treaties, including the International Bill of Human Rights, and strive to ensure no complicity whatsoever with human rights abuses. Because it's not my ambition to run the kind of company that is involved with human rights abuses. Therefore, I vet and monitor my customers. And this also brings us to the first enforceable standard, ethical standard. In particular, I do not engage in any business with entities known for abusing human rights and reserve the right to suspend or cease business operation with entities found at a later time to be involved with human rights abuses. Going further and moving from it, principle B, it's about not posing danger to human health. So I want to champion the health of human beings and commit to not enable my customers with capabilities that may pose a direct danger to human health. As a result, I have 2 corresponding ethical standards. The first of which is about inadmissible capabilities, and the second is about trade secret. In particular, I do not engage in any trade or capabilities that exploit vulnerabilities in medical devices or systems to which human life is entrusted, unless the vendor is or the affected device or system is the acquiring entity, or the acquiring entity has been delegated or authorized by the vendor to be the recipient of the vulnerability disclosure process. Also, I never trade in stolen trade secrets and require my suppliers to certify that they have independently discovered the vulnerability and autonomously develop the related technology. And also that they are not employees or target software manufacturer, nor they have received access to confidential information through a disclosure process from the same. Which is to say that no, I don't want that software developers join the bug bonanza and write them a new minivan today, right? Furthermore, I want to avoid conflict of interest. So I strive to benefit those we do business with and take a great deal of care to avoid possible conflict of interest that could cause the company, the employees or contractors to pursue goals not in the interest of the company's business peers. Similarly to what happened before, I have 2 corresponding ethical standards. The standard 4 about overexploitation and standard 5 about unintended use. In particular, I will protect the value of the trade capabilities, and I will specify the maximum number of entities and the maximum number of times for which I am willing to sell the same capabilities, unless that capabilities is going to be used for risk mitigation purposes. And I strive not to sell the vulnerability to one party and the technology to defend against the vulnerability to another party that is likely to be a target of the first. Furthermore, I prohibit myself, the employees and contractors, to use the information or the capabilities traded in the fulfillment of the service to pursue personal goals. Only authorized personnel can process the vulnerability information received in the fulfillment of the service only for validation purposes and risk and research and development in general. Of course, I want to obey the law and comply with all applicable legal requirements and standards regarding trade controls, anti-bribery, money laundering, insider trading, and more. In particular, when it comes to exporting products and services to other countries, I strive to meet the criteria required in the export license, where applicable, and keep me abreast of change applicable to the export licensing system. Principle E is about preserving the confidentiality. The confidentiality not only of the parties involved, of course, sure enough, but also the confidentiality of the information I process and the intellectual property I receive and provide to my business partners. So what I do in the day-to-day business is to restrict access to the information and the intellectual property received from or provide to business partners on a need-to-know basis and enforcing a principle of least privilege. And finally, as a fallback mechanism, I am embracing the doctrine of double effect and double use as the principle F. Essentially, what I'm doing here is to acknowledge the capabilities I provide may be used with goods that, just like all cybersecurity tools, are inherently dual use. And as such, can be used in military context for criminal law investigation and like. Therefore, when used for military purposes, the trade capabilities may have a double effect. The intended effect and the foreseen but genuinely unintended consequences. So while advising against the possible harmful effects, I acknowledge the inherent duality or the effects resulting from the use of those capabilities, and I accept to trade them as long as they comply with the principles and standards of the Code of Ethics. Standard number 8 about duality: enforce principle F in a strict way. And that's pretty much it as far as my Code of Ethics goes. Today, I'm honored to be with you back in Moscow. I'm reminded about the Russian-born Aliza Zinoyevna Rosenbaum, also known as Ayn Rand, whom once remarked, every aspect of Western culture needs new code of ethics, a rational ethics as a precondition of rebirth. I feel similarly when it comes to vulnerabilities. Every aspect of the vulnerability supply chain needs a new code of ethics, a rational ethics as a precondition of rebirth. And if, as noted by Earl Warren, a jurist in the United States, in a civilized life, law floats in a sea of ethics, it's both my hope and wish that our reflection that will ensue today will inform policymakers. I welcome all your thoughts. And I have 2 T-shirts for the best questions in the Q&A session. So let's get started. Thank you. Any questions? Sure.
Thank you. I'm from Positive Technologies. My name is Vladimir. You mentioned a lot of principles, but what we have in practice, it's a lot of theory things, but it all comes to ethic problem, as I think.
Definitely. I mentioned not only a theory, I mentioned 6 principles and 8 corresponding ethical standards. So while the principles are aspirational goals, the ethical standards are enforceable rules in my day-to-day business operation. So whenever you found a standard in my slide deck, this is something I actually do in my day-to-day business operation, for real.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely, it's very important. It's not only about a reflection. I need to run the business in an ethically sound way. Of course,
that's all we need to mention, but few of this principle work in everyday life.
In the real life, some of them have some real-world consequences, absolutely. Some are more relevant in order to reassure some parties, some constituents at large about the conduct of my business. Because this kind of activity has been profoundly misrepresented by the press from time to time. So I want to both educate the conduct of business, but also to reassure all the constituents at large about what is going on in Zero Nomicon.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Any more questions?
A question of practical use of these principles. For example, you find a vulnerability in some software and report it to the vendor. And the vendor says like, okay, it's a vulnerability, but I'm not going to fix it, I'm not interested. What should you do? What's the ethical way of handling this problem?
What's the ethical way? This is a tough question. Here, I don't pretend to have definitive answer for it, because it's a challenge. It's an ethical challenge. Sure enough, as long as the acquiring entity is not interested in receiving the disclosure or that research, I cannot complete the transaction. So it's the seller, the vulnerability researcher, in this case, to be in charge. So the vulnerability researcher retains all the rights regarding his own or her own intellectual property. So the real question becomes what the vulnerability researcher should do. Of course, there are different vulnerability disclosure policies, and it's up to the researcher to value what works best. I believe they should put in the right context. As for me, I believe that each single vulnerability disclosure policy, ranging from full disclosure to responsible disclosure to coordinated vulnerability disclosure, comes with their ethical challenges. So there's no bulletproof, there's no silver bullet here from an ethical standpoint.
No, I think the same.
Any more questions? No more questions? So thank you for coming.